Why hello YouTube! Greetings from the Lazy Eyebrow to Tutorial 5, Transformation. So far everything we've covered has benefited the average user no matter what they're animating with. We no longer use the sun as our light source. The advice for those that use something to lean their camera on was pretty clear cut and dry.
Just buy a tripod!
Our motion eases in, stays consistent, and then eases out. Walking looks better than a ballroom shuffle, and flying is now possible for anyone who went and built a rig. Now we're going to look at transformations, and more specifically what I've been referring to as transformation cheating.
Transformations, and the fact that our toys have 2 or more modes, might just be what draws us so much to animating these particular toys. For that matter, it's certainly what draws us to the movies with untold amounts of compilations of just the transformation sequences. There's something about making the whole Rubik's Cube-like puzzle box mechanisms come to life simultaneously that just seem to captivate us. Now, on the amateur animation side of things, the majority of us will animate our figures transforming by following the steps in our instructions, just executed 2 or 3 or even all of the steps at a time. For some transformations, this works, especially for some of the simpler figures like Earthrise Datsuns or the G1 toys or even something like the Legends figures from years past. But then you hit figures with faux parts and it's like, what do you do? You could animate the steps anyway, this could work, and for some animations it doesn't look terrible. But I'm of the opinion that doing that doesn't quite capture the spirit of the transformation in your animation. You might also see at this point why I've voiced my discontent with faux parts over the years, as the more fake parts you introduce into a figure, the harder it is to make your transformation look good. But that's not to say it's impossible. Despite the amount of faux parts on Siege Mirage and a multitude of Optimus Primes lately, myself as well as a good number of other animators have overcome these hurdles in the transformation with a bit of visual trickery, and drawing attention away from the parts that need to get a little wild. So let's go over how to do this. Before you start animating, you need to have a good look at your figure. You need to figure out what their defining features are, how you want them to move, and these features are what need to stay consistent. For Optimus, I would say it's the chest windows, the grille, the wheels and the legs, little details that your eyes are immediately drawn to that make you know that yes, this is Optimus Prime. For Mirage, you have the chest as the front of the car. In fact, the majority of Autobots, you can label their chest as the defining feature, and you wouldn't be that far off. Next, you need to think about the way you want it to move in your end product, and despite knowing that your figure can't actually move that way, you need to set up your frame so that you can trick your audience into thinking that it can. For Optimus, it's a well-known transformation seen in his G1 toy and heavily throughout the old cartoon. The chest and grille become the front of the truck, the arms slam themselves into the side, and he basically lays down with his torso vertical as a truck cap. So let's make Earthrise Prime look like he can do that. Here we have him just about ready to go down into the truck. For our first 2 frames, we're going to throw his arms backwards and begin to rotate his head back. This is another reason why I love this figure, as it means you don't have to cheat the head going into the front windows like a lot of the other Optimus Prime figures. Anyway, on frame 3, I've taken the entire hidden part of the truck and fully transformed it. This does make the headlights seem to pop out of nowhere, but again, your audience's focus is on the defining features. To them, between the frames, all that's really noticed is the grille is slightly changed shape, and the torso itself seems to have bulked out a bit. Now, because balancing these poses is tricky, feel free to use sticky tack or some combination of rigging or some other prop that you can mask out to support your figure as they go from their standing position to essentially laying down in a matter of a full second. In this case, I use a printed Mjolnir and then his rifle itself to support this awkward lean, as I hadn't built my rig yet at this point of time. Now, you may have missed that our hands have actually disappeared. This was accomplished in 2 ways. First, on his right hand, it was pointed directly at the camera before we changed. So when we go from this frame to the next, instead of a hand just disappearing, from our perspective, it only just seemed to change color in the corner of our eye, while our focus was on the chest. However, that's not what I did for the other arm, seeing as how that is perpendicular to our camera view. For that arm between frames, I lined the edge of the arm up horizontally speaking with where the edge of the hand used to be. Again, all your eye really detects is more of a color change in this area more than it does random bits of robot disappearing. Finally, we get to this part, and sometimes with Optimus transformations this can be especially tricky. In one frame, we completely rotate around the torso, which flips our legs upside down and in this case makes our front bumper appear. To do this, I've set up the waist area so that it sort of appears as though the silver bumper has just morphed into it as the colors are visually similar. I've set the legs up in previous frames as though they were on their way to straightening out, so the fact that we've lost our knees no longer matters as it looks natural. And finally, I've lined up the wheels in such a way that their movement itself looks as though it's carrying on like nothing's happened to really sell the visual trick. Our next frame we're going to be doing some transformation easing in. Basically, you get your figure to a point that's mostly transformed, but all the panels are slightly askew, like it's just finishing up everything. And then on your next frame, you're done. Optimus, complete with hiding away all the faux parts. Now for a recent faux transformation I've done that even I'm blown away was accomplished. Mirage. By all counts, this transformation should be near impossible, as the chest piece is short, fat, and squat, and the actual nose is long, slender, and narrow. So for this transformation, and given that I mentioned earlier that the chest is probably what the eye is going to be focused on, I started by using the armature to get the chest almost into a position of it extending in front of the car mode, and getting the arms into a position where it appeared they were beginning to fold under the car while rotating the tires out. In this case, I used the rig to support the awkward angle the figure was at, as well as made the legs spin around kind of unrealistically. This was supposed to be a proof of concept, and I was more or less unconcerned by how the legs move for this, but it ended up working in my favor and I ended up keeping it. It all came to this point where I had flattened out the fake nose of the car so that it was as flat as I could make it with the camera. Sometimes it's easy to forget that while you're dealing with a three-dimensional object in hand, you're taking a two-dimensional image, and depth of field is something that can be played around with as it doesn't exactly translate in a two-dimensional image. In the next frame is where all the visual trickery happens. Between these frames I've done a great deal of the transformation, but have kept a few key points of the figure in smooth motion for your brain to latch onto. For one, the Autobot symbol from the fake chest is still moving in a smooth arc. The front tires of the car are near where the tires coming from the chest once were, and likewise the back tires are positioned in a way that appears as though they're also continuing their consistent motion. Regarding the rest of the colors, the shoulder hinge shares the same color as the foot of the next frame, helping to convince the brain that it's the same part when played fast, just shrunken. The spoiler panel of the arms appears to have shrunk down to the silver knee panel over here, and the brain fills in the rest, assuming that all of this blue was just behind that panel the whole time, and now that panel is just no longer obstructed. From there, it's just polishing up the rest of the vehicle, and we're off to the races. Again, what you're really doing for these transformations cheats is making sure that the parts that catch the eye, in this case the wheels and the nose of the car, are smooth. Everything else can do pretty much whatever it wants, so long as it's not too jarring of a color or placement wise. And these aren't the only techniques you can use either. For instance, in this Cyclonus backflip, the only parts actually transforming are the ones that aren't facing the camera. Take this nose cone for instance, all done in one frame but made believable because it happened behind the legs obstructing the view of them. And then the wings are flipped the right way around when flat against the camera and therefore no longer having any sort of depth of field to distinguish their orientation until after they had been transformed. Basically, if you don't have to show the transformation, don't. The brain fills in the rest. And the best part of it all is, if you can get the hang of these techniques with one figure, you can actually swap in figures in between transformation and have it look natural. You can use the defining features of Optimus to swap figures mid-transformation and no one's the wiser. Spy Crab used the shin panels from Siege Ironhide to help transition the fact that he turned into Masterpiece Ironhide. Optimus Time Lord used Photoshop parts of the Masterpiece Seekers in a composite shot to have them turn into the Impossible Toys Tetra Jets for his recreation of the Cybertron scenes. Patrick Boivin used a combination of green screen effects and motion blur to make Reveltech movie Optimus turn into Leader Clash Avenge of the Fallen Optimus Prime. Heck, Monsieur Boivin way back in 2008 made a custom-built, non-transforming, General Lee-themed Gundam transform out of a model car that was replaced between frames by another model that had panels on armatures that moved themselves into a position that allowed the Gundam appear to seamlessly transition from a car into robot. Needless to say, Patrick Boivin served us a lot of my animation inspiration before I started this channel.
So to recap, pick a few of the aesthetic points of your robot that make your robot what it is and make those points transition smoothly. Where you can, hide your transformations. Let your audience's brain fill in the gaps in between. And where you can't, make sure everything flows smoothly in the parts where your focal point is. Anyway, this went on a little longer than I wanted it to. It's just one of my favorite techniques, and I wanted to really dig deep into how it all works, as it's a question I get frequently. Tune into the next tutorial where I might take a while making it, as I have to teach myself a whole new editing software program so that I can teach you how to add audio effects and voice and really bring that extra polish to your final animation. This has been the Lazy Eyebrow.